Please give a warm welcome to the host of Broadway Buzz, Mr. Joe Gary.
Thank you, and welcome to Broadway Buzz, and welcome to Moulin Rouge. And what a spectacle it is. Spectacular choreography, spectacular visuals, lighting, staging, performances, innovative music. It's an extraordinary work, and you're in for a great treat. Let us go back. Theater is always about three things: time, place, and action. Time, meaning the year, in this case, 1889, the passage of time, several months, the time of day. All of these elements are very important in creating the atmosphere, the idiom of the story. And then place, of course, means location. And it means the city where it's happening. It means the particular setting where it's happening. It means the changing of settings that we see. All of this will impact the telling of the story. And then finally, of course, we have characters in action, or action, meaning that's what the storyline really is. And in this case, it's a beautiful story about a young boy in the musical. He's from Ohio, and he journeys off to Paris. He's a composer, and of course he's going to Paris in one of the headiest times of its illustrious history. He will fall in love with the star of the Moulin Rouge, Satine, who was a waif from the streets, who was a prostitute, who became one of the great entertainers of the day. And so it's a very unlikely story of two very unlikely people meeting and falling in love. Okay, so let's look at this to see how heady this really is. Okay, so in dealing with the issue of time, we're talking about the period in France that is called La Belle Epoque, the beautiful time. The French defined that period as the last 10 years of the 1800s, going into and leading up to the beginning of World War I. It was a period of tremendous prosperity. It was a period of tremendous social upheaval. I mean, this is the period where people moved from the farms to the city. This is the beginning, of course, of the Industrial Revolution. This is the period where there is a rising middle class who had money to spend. Keep in mind, the French, of course, called that middle class la bourgeoisie, and so they would set the standard of what the French wanted in this period. Good family life, good religious life, sound economic life, celebrating all the innovations that were happening as we moved into the 20th century. So the Belle Epoque is very rich. But also, it was a very rich period for the development of science. There was a great art exhibit in Paris that, of course, people from all over the world came to. It was called the Exhibition of 1889. And in that exhibition, they showcased all the great inventions: the birth of electricity, the birth of the telephone, the birth of the telegraph, the birth of the bicycle, the birth of the automobile. And so it goes on and on and on. All of these phenomenal inventions that would challenge and change our lives. There was an amazing elephant that they built for this exhibition. The French always do things in a very big way. It was a 3-story elephant, and the audience would go up the legs of the elephant in circular staircases, and in the belly of the elephant, they would reveal all of the great innovations of the day, including electricity, and the elephant was electrified. Remember this elephant. The elephant's going to come back and play a very important part. Okay, so aside from this period, aside from the tremendous transformation that happened in the way people lived, in the way people valued things, in all of the innovations that happened, it was also one of the greatest periods we had in art. And as you remember, in Paris, everyone gathered there. The great painters, the great sculptors, the great composers, the great novelists, the great poets, everyone gathered in the city of La Belle Epoque. So this is a very heady time. One thing I want you to know about the artists in this period, they called themselves Bohemian. And that term really came from an area in sort of Central Europe. Actually, it would be in modern day Czechoslovakia. It would be sort of in the middle of Czechoslovakia. But there was an area called Bohemia, and a group of gypsies made their base there. They were called the Romani people. And they had a complete contradiction in terms of values of what the bourgeois wanted. They didn't want family life. They didn't want to live in a neat little house. They didn't want to go to a proper little church every week. They were nomads, and they believed that what was important were 4 ideas, and these are the ideas that these artists would incorporate into everything they did. And it is beauty, freedom, truth, and love. Those were the 4 great premises of the Bohemian movement. In a way, we can sort of equate this to the beatnik movement we had in the 1950s, where artists said, you know, you don't have to have possessions, you don't have to have the traditional family life, you don't have to do the traditional things everyone is really expected to do. You can work for a greater sense of personal freedom. And while, you know, we can relate to that from that sort of beatnik movement, we never had the brilliant artists that the Bohemian movement had. Remember, we had everyone from Modigliani to Picasso, and they were all of the painters were all gathering in Paris at that time. And more specifically now, to define place, there is an area in Paris called Montmartre. And it's in the 18th arrondissement. It was one of the last districts to be added to Paris. It's sort of in the northern part of Paris, and before it was part of Paris proper, it was just the area known as Montmartre, and it was a very hilly area. And in the 1800s, there were windmills on every one of the hills because they were making flour there. Keep in mind the title of our show, Moulin Rouge, the greatest cabaret in the world, literally translated, means red windmill. And so it, in the tradition of the windmills of Montmartre, would build the largest and most famous windmill of all, the great entertainment area known as Moulin Rouge. Okay, so this is the environment in which we're working. Remember, in Montmartre, all of the artists would literally gather on the street and paint in all of the little squares. It's very atmospheric. I mean, when you go to Paris, one of the first things you do is a walking tour of Montmartre. And again, even today, you see artists in all the little squares painting. Easels are everywhere. You trip over easels on every street corner as artists are painting. So it remains this sort of center for artists to gather. This was also true with poets, with sculptors, with literary figures. They all gathered into this tiny little village we know of as Montmartre. In this same period, in 1899, several extraordinary visual things would happen in Paris. The Eiffel Tower would be built. Sacré-Cœur, one of the greatest cathedrals, would be built on the highest point in Montmartre. It was built in honor of all of the French people who lost their lives during the Franco-Prussian War when they were defending Paris from the invaders. And so this magnificent cathedral is built. Those of you who have been to Paris know that you can see Sacré-Cœur all over Paris. I mean, it sort of dominates the vista, and it's one of the jewels of Paris, as, of course, the Eiffel Tower is. And in that same year, then we had the Moulin Rouge being built. Now, let's talk about the Moulin Rouge, since that's not only the title of our show, but the setting for our show. And the show is told that we see characters performing on the stage of the Moulin Rouge, but then we see a backstage story where we see the great painter Toulouse-Lautrec, who's trying to put together a musical to save the Moulin Rouge. So it's sort of a story within a story. It's a story of what happened at the Moulin Rouge, and it's a backstory of what happens when a group of artists are trying to create a musical to save the Moulin Rouge. Okay, so things you need to know about the Moulin Rouge. Keep in mind, in 1899, when all of the aristocrats from all over the world flocked to Paris, and everyone went there because it was the epicenter of what was cutting edge. You know, the French have this term called avant-garde, meaning ahead of its time. And of course, the French are always ahead of the time in fashion, in literature, in music, in art, and all of the great movements that would happen in that period in art would all begin in Montmartre. Okay, so all this is going on in Paris at the time, and the Moulin Rouge opens to add to the excitement. When the royal family of England travels to France for the first time in hundreds of years, they don't want to go to the Eiffel Tower, they want to go to the Moulin Rouge because it's such a decadent and cutting-edge place to be. The thing that made the Moulin Rouge so decadent was the dance they invented, which was, of course, the can-can. And as you know, when we see the can-can, even today, when you see that kick line, I mean, we all have goosebumps. It's a magical kind of performance that is synonymous with everything that is theatrical. So the Moulin Rouge would draw the wealthiest people in the world, the most privileged people in the world, but then also it would draw the prostitutes, the drug dealers. It had this wide range of appeal. Let me just remind you that there are very few examples of this in the history of entertainment. You know, we go back to the period of Shakespeare in the 1600s in England, and we go to the Globe Theater. In the Globe Theater, the very wealthy would sit in the stalls, the titled nobility would sit in the stalls, and then right in front of the stage, we had what we call groundlings, who could be prostitutes. We recognize them because they usually sold oranges. That was a healthy thing to do. And drug dealers and pickpockets. So Shakespeare drew everyone from the greatest intellects, where he gave them the greatest language, the greatest ideas, but then also he created all of these farcical scenes that were so memorable and delightful. You responded to totally on a visceral level, and that, of course, was for the groundlings. So Shakespeare understood what an eclectic theater could be. And so this is what the Moulin Rouge was. The very rich, the very poor, the washed, the unwashed, the educated, the illiterate, everyone flocked to the Moulin Rouge, all because of the can-can. And just so you know, there were times at the can-can when our beloved dancers forgot to wear their bloomers. So you can imagine the shock when they lifted up their skirts, right? So in any case, the French, in order to deal with this in a sort of nonplussed, sophisticated way, hired a group of men called the Fathers of Decency, who were assigned to go to the Moulin Rouge to make certain that the girls were properly attired. Okay, so all this is going on at the Moulin Rouge. Now, about that elephant I told you about, who was the star in 1889 of, you know, this groundbreaking exhibition where they were showing all these modern things that were happening to the world. That elephant was purchased by the Moulin Rouge, and it was moved into their garden. So I want you, the show that you see will take place in the Moulin Rouge on the stage, but in the area around it, and in Montmartre, and in Toulouse-Lautrec's studio, and at sidewalk cafes, the wide range of the atmospheric period that they've placed this show in. You don't literally see the 3-story elephant, but he plays a very important part in the story. It was put in the garden at the Moulin Rouge. So in the afternoon, families would go to the gardens at the Moulin Rouge where they would picnic, and there were little gazebos where bands would play and people would dance in the afternoon. What a civilized thing to do. And you know, we think of some of the great paintings from that period that showed people dancing outside in the afternoon, and it's really referring to those gardens at the Moulin Rouge. But they also had this huge elephant there. It wasn't being used in such a delightful way as it was in 1889. Rather, it was now a private gentleman's club. I don't have to go into too many details about that, other than to tell you the gentleman would go up those legs, and in the body of the elephant, they could meet a private dancer, eat your heart out, Tina Turner, and they could drink absinthe, which was a green alcohol that was very addictive, that was very hallucinogenic. Toulouse-Lautrec, who immortalizes this whole period as, you know, the great painter of that whole phenomena of the Moulin Rouge. He was a very small man. He was from an aristocratic family. He had 2 legs that were highly deformed because he kept breaking them. The family was wealthy and aristocratic, and there was a lot of problems genetically in the family, and he had weak bones that kept breaking. But Toulouse-Lautrec always carried 2 canes, but he hollowed them out so he could store absinthe in it, so he was never without his hallucinogenic supply of alcohol that he needed. So in any case, in this private club then, gentlemen went there to meet ladies for private dances, and it was a very notorious place. But I just want you to be aware, think of the juxtaposition of families picnicking on the lawn and then all this debauchery going on in the elephant. Why the elephant is important to us in this story: Satine, who is the young, beautiful star of the Moulin Rouge, lives in the story that we see in the head of the elephant. And she has an apartment, and again, because it's 3 stories high, it would have this magnificent vista of Paris, which you see through the windows, and you see the windmills and all of the wonderful things that identify us with Montmartre. And notice that when you see those scenes, when we're in Satine's bedroom or her private quarters, that you see a frame around it, and it looks like an elephant's head. And that's, of course, to symbolize that her apartment really is in the head of the elephant. They talk about it in language, but we literally don't see this magnificent structure, but we see the outline of it when we see her room. Okay, so the story then that's being told, as I told you, is about the young boy, Christian, who journeys from Ohio. How could anything be further removed in that period, from life in the Midwest, to going to this cutting-edge place where everyone in the world was gathering, and the greatest artists were creating this whole new kind of sort of post-impressionism that was extraordinary. And when he goes to Paris, the first person he meets is Toulouse-Lautrec. And Toulouse-Lautrec takes him in, encourages him to be the composer of the musical they're going to write to save the Moulin Rouge. And then our story evolves from there. So let us look then at the source of this story. So we're looking at the great movie Moulin Rouge, which was released in 2001. It was directed by Baz Luhrmann. As many of you know, Baz Luhrmann is one of our great film directors. We really call him an auteur because, unlike most directors, he has this phenomenal skill in dealing with cinematography, the camera, storyline. He's highly innovative in the way, for those of us who grew up in the late 50s and 1960s, when we had the great filmmakers like Fellini, Antonioni, Bergman, and they experimented so significantly with the cinema. In the same way, Baz Luhrmann has done that from the 1990s to the present, and his most recent film, Elvis. Okay, but he would do a trilogy of films in the 1990s that would be called the Red Curtain Trilogy. And they included Strictly Ballroom, his first major movie, then Romeo and Juliet with Leonardo DiCaprio, which was a modern version of it. Both of these films using music in a very innovative way, using the camera in a very innovative way, and editing. But his greatest triumph would be the third movie that was part of the Red Curtain Trilogy, which would be Moulin Rouge. And he would invent this story of the young boy falling in love with the great courtesan, and then see the sort of tragic story that happened. Baz Luhrmann, probably his greatest contribution with Moulin Rouge is with what he did with music. Remember, we were very familiar with jukebox musical now. We know that you can take pre-existing music and use it in the telling of a new story, which is what happens in Moulin Rouge. But Baz Luhrmann does this in a very extraordinary way, in a very groundbreaking way. He calls what he does mash up. And it's a term in music, mash up, which means that you can take lyrics from one song and reconnect them with the melody of another song. Or you can take lyrics from one song, cut it up, and insert other lyrics from another song with those lyrics. In other words, it's remixing music in a very offbeat way. And what Baz Luhrmann did in this film is he borrowed music from a 150-year period, so that it's everything from the music of Offenbach to Lady Gaga. And so it's really a tremendous and very eye-opening experience to have music that is so assaultive. The first time you hear music in the movie and in the musical, we meet Toulouse-Lautrec, the great painter, and he starts singing the melody line from Sound of Music, but he's singing it with very different lyrics. So we're assaulted right at the very beginning, knowing that we're going to see a musical that uses music in a very unusual and offbeat way. And what you discover with Baz Luhrmann, both in the movie and then ultimately in the musical, is how brilliant this device really is and how powerful it is, you know, to mix David Bowie with 1970s funk and to throw in Tina Turner and to have this very eclectic musical soundtrack that becomes so perfect for the telling of the story. Baz Luhrmann in all of his films very often uses famous myths to back up his story. And in the case of Moulin Rouge, the story of the young lover who falls in love with this exotic woman, the performer, and their tragic love story. He will use the Orpheus and Eurydice legend. Now, you're all experts in that. I mean, you've all seen Hadestown, and you understand that Orpheus, the god of music, would be so in love that he would follow his beloved to the depths of hell to try and save her. And that's exactly what Christian does in this story. So we are re-seeing the Orpheus and Eurydice legend. We're also re-seeing the Romeo and Juliet story. And so Baz Luhrmann likes to use mashup, not only in the music, but also in the storytelling, so that he uses a great deal of literature. There is a very famous 19th century novel that Alexandre Dumas wrote. It was called The Lady of the Camellias, and we know the central figure as Camille. And she has tuberculosis, and she's one of the great beauties in France at the period, and it's a tremendous story. I mean, in the 19th century, it was one of the greatest novels of the period. And so he will use that story also in the telling of this story. Also, he will use another very famous French story written by Émile Zola, and it was called Nana. I got busted because of Nana when I was 13. I lived in this tiny town, and our library, you know, was in the police station. And I went to to try and sneak out Nana because I had heard it was so salacious. And I got busted by the librarian, and she called my mother. But that's another story. But I'm happy to tell you, I did read it, and while I was 13 at the time, at the end of the summer, I was 30. So it did change my life, and so wonderful to see the innuendos of Nana. I'm probably the only one who sees it in both the film and in the musical. Okay, so we know that Baz Luhrmann tells this very powerful ancient story of love, thwarted love, disappointed love, broken love, and he tells it in a very powerful melodramatic way in this brilliant movie, Moulin Rouge. So after the movie comes out in 2001, 2 years later, Las Vegas announces that they're going to present the most spectacular stage musical ever, and it was going to be Moulin Rouge. Never happened. Then 2 years after that, Baz Luhrmann announced that in London, he was going to do a stage musical version of Moulin Rouge. In the past, many of you know, he had taken La Bohème and treated that as a musical on the stage to great effect. So in any case, that was announced. He was going to use the original stars of the film. That didn't happen. And finally, in 2016, an Australian company announced, producers announced that they were going to present the show in New York, and happily they did. Okay, remember now, when they're working on this stage version of the musical, it's 16 years after Baz Luhrmann made the movie. And remember that a large number of very important pieces of music would come out in that period. So what you see, those of you who love the movie, will see that the musical is really, the storyline is very similar, but what's going to be different is the addition of extraordinary music that really adds to the impact of the story we're going to see. Okay, and the producers were very smart to hire Alex Timbers as the director of this enormous project to transform this much-loved movie that is a sort of perfect movie. And you know, how do you put that on the stage? And Alex Timbers does it brilliantly. You know Alex Timbers because he had created Beetlejuice. He was the director of Beetlejuice. And as you remember in the stories we talked about that, he spent 10 years developing that. In the same 10 years, he was developing Moulin Rouge, two very different musicals, two of them making enormous impacts on Broadway. What's similar about both is that you see a director who works so meticulously with each artist, the set designer, the costume designer, the book writer, the person putting together the music. He works so carefully and in such detail that everything becomes singular. You can't separate the music from the story or the characters from the situation. And then again, you know, in this case, he's dealing with this very heady period, the Belle Epoque and Montmartre and the greatest artists of the day. And one of the central characters in the story is Toulouse-Lautrec. And so, you know, you have all of this atmosphere, all of this brilliance. I mean, just watch in terms of Toulouse-Lautrec. There is a moment in the second act where they're trying to put together part of the scenery, and you see the stagehands sort of tying the set piece to the pole that they're going to fly out. When they fly that out at the end of the scene, it takes your breath away because you're seeing all of these famous Toulouse-Lautrec images that are so embedded in our mind. And it's so shocking when you see that curtain that you really recognize every visual reference to it. And then watch deep in the second act as we move towards the conclusion, everyone starts looking like they're out of a Toulouse-Lautrec painting, with the hair, with the clothes, with the postures, with the louche atmosphere that's created, the decadent atmosphere that's created. It's extraordinary. So this show keeps functioning on so many different levels. If you're really a musical theater buff, you will recognize endless references to other musicals in this moment. I mean, there's a scene where the courtesan is taken by the Duke to buy fancy clothes, and it's right out of My Fair Lady. You see the opening of the second act, where you see two dancers backstage, and it's right out of the opening of Kiss Me Kate, and it goes on and on and on. So if you love the musical theater, you make lots of references. If you love opera, you'll recognize references to La Bohème and Traviata. If you love literature, you'll see the references that I referred to. And if you don't know any of it, it doesn't make any difference because you're still going to have a wonderful time. It is that kind of musical that is so dense. There are so many levels to it, as was true with Beatlemania, that you can keep viewing it on so many different levels. So you're in for a great treat. Please enjoy Moulin Rouge. Thank you.